evening, everybody. Welcome to this event. Thank you all for coming. Before we start, thanks again to Denton's and colleagues for hosting us and looking after us in a wonderful venue on a wonderful evening. For those that haven't been before, this evening's event is part of our ongoing City Horizons series. And it's a series where we take an opportunity to think about some of those bigger issues and those longer term trends that are affecting cities, not only in the UK, but actually across the globe. And I guess tonight's speaker and the topic probably fits that bill better than many or most in terms of what we're going to cover in the topic that we're going to explore tonight. Our speaker is Monica Smith. Monica is Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles, amongst many other things. And she is the author of a brilliant book called Cities, the First 6,000 Years, which is the subject of the events, tonight's event. You can also listen to Monica talk about the book. We did a podcast earlier on in the year where we explored some of these, but I know she's going to explore much more of those issues in tonight's lecture.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to think about cities in, of course, one of the world's great cities that we can see right out the window. And although I do have some visuals for the talk this evening, I can certainly understand if your eyes stray to this magnificent landscape that is, of course, a palimpsest not only of the 21st century, but the 20th century. And I think, you can probably see a little piece of the Roman wall under there as well. And I think that provides us a lovely background for thinking about the ways that cities have become the anchors of the modern world and that we have inherited from our prior urban architects and urban planners and urban livers, the kind of thing that we enjoy today. So if we think about the development of cities, what we have is the development of an urban networked world that began around 6,000 years ago. And through archaeology, what we can do is bridge that world of 6,000 years ago with the world of today and this kind of globalized network of urbanism that we find ourselves in. Now, you might ask about archaeology and why it is that we need to investigate ancient cities and maybe how do we find some of these ancient cities. Well, in some cases, they are not that difficult to find. Although we think of archaeologists often digging, it's pretty much the last thing that we do because excavation is quite time-consuming. It's also very expensive. And so the more we can learn about ancient cities or any other kind of phenomenon through non-invasive means, that's where we begin. And of course, many cities, like the great city of Ur now in southern Iraq, are cities that never disappeared, and they were not so difficult to find. This idea of the remains of the past is true not only in places like Mesopotamia or the great jungles of Mexico and Central America, or the Inca sites of South America, but also in the Indian subcontinent, where I've had the pleasure of doing work with my Indian colleagues. And this is the central portion of the ancient city of Shishapalgarh, where you have these monumental stone pillars that have been standing for the last 2,000 years or so. So the signposts of urbanism are often right there on the surface and very easily read by people, whether archaeologists or not. And then there are other ways of finding out about ancient cities that give us a sense of that scope and size of those ancient urban habitations, that we use a whole variety of strategies from remote sensing and satellite imagery to below-the-ground prospection, and then even the field walking of these sites where we can get, amazingly enough, a lot of evidence from the surface itself. So we have, as we walk over the ground surface, we can see those monumental pillars, but we can also see the little potsherds and fragments of bricks and tiles and debris from manufacturing that provide the evidence of the size and the scale of the ancient cities that we investigate. It's only after we have exhausted all of those modes of inquiry, from satellite imagery to field walking to below ground prospection, that we get to the job of archaeology that you are probably most familiar with through television and other means, and that is the excavation part. And this is where we go through the layers of time, bit by bit, to get down to the very earliest parts of an urban habitation. But that kind of research is also not only painstaking, but something that produces a window into the past that you can't get any other way. And it's through that you realize how much we're missing from the surface. Here is an example of those big monumental pillars that I had shown you before, and then our excavations of an adjacent area where we thought we had some more pillared structures, but there was hardly anything that you could see from the surface. The site in total is a kilometer square, about the size of this view that you could see out the window. Excavation, at best in a single season, can get you as much room as we have in this room where we're sitting. We're trying to put together the story of a whole ancient city is a matter of almost surgically precise excavations in one place after another that then enables us to understand what's happening in the whole broad realm by process of analogy and comparison, and sometimes just a little luck as well. Urban sites tend to be astonishingly deep, and this is another one of the challenges of archaeology, is that we know that the beginnings of ancient cities happened down there somewhere. But where in your urban center are you going to poke a hole to go all the way down and hope that you find the very first small settlement at the beginning of that process? This is why answering the questions of the very earliest cities and urban beginnings, those questions are often the most tantalizing, the most difficult to answer, because we are trying to look down through these many, many layers. You can get a similar sense in London from the many times that people have put in subway access or basements or new constructions and found pieces of Roman London underfoot. And there's a wonderful museum here, Museum of London, very close by, that you can go and see all of these little pieces of the Roman world that turn up. And by drawing them on a map, we can trace out what it was that was happening 2,000 years ago. Not only here in London, but in practically every city, everywhere on the planet. We get those little tantalizing glimpses of the past that was there before us. So what is it that constitutes the building blocks of ancient cities? You might think that if ancient cities are so prevalent and they were so successful that some of them live on for thousands of years later, that urbanism was perhaps the natural habitat of our species. Actually, that's not true at all. The first cities only came along about 6,000 years ago, when human beings had already been in existence as Homo sapiens for at least 100,000 years or so, with all of the basic capacities to communicate and interact such that cities were not really necessary from the beginning, but people had some capacities that ended up being essential to what eventually became our modern urban way of life. One of these is the capacity to communicate, this concept of language that was something that brought in not only conversation about the here and now, but also about things that you could only imagine, like the future, or something you could only remember, like the past. So as human beings, we can live in the present perfectly well, but having an ability to talk about the past, to remember something that worked or didn't work, and to envision the future, how we can make things better, is something that became an essential building block of urbanism. Another thing that is an essential building block is objects. So human beings have an enormous quantity of stuff It's one of the things that defines us as a species. We are very interested in acquiring new objects, in displaying objects. If you think about things like ornamentation or fashion, those tendencies that we've had as a species for a very long time certainly become accelerated and accented in the productive and consumptive networks of cities. And if we think about the ways in which ancient people also used objects, what we see in ancient cities when we dig those holes way down to the beginning of urban occupation, what we see is an enormous amount of trash. So if we think of ourselves as bad modern people in the 21st century, that we're going to practice getting things and throwing them away, don't feel bad. Takeout food and trash have been part of the urban experience since the very beginning. Not only that, but cities become the focal points of networked interaction from one place to the next, overcoming national boundaries, extending beyond the limits of any political domain, and having a capacity to let people interact over large amounts of space by sharing objects that become fashionable and that everybody wants to have. So in the Roman period, you have these distributions of artifacts that are made in Italy, but find themselves being consumed all over the area that we think of as Western Europe. And that same kind of object, these airtime bowls, very nice looking kinds of presentation ware that were cheap enough for everyone to be able to afford. They were being manufactured at the rate of 20 to 25,000 pieces at a time. So they were really fueling the consumption of this Roman pottery all over the Roman world, which of course included the UK. And that production was not only coming from a single zone of Italy, but it started being imitated. So the idea of cheap knockoffs is not something that's unique to the 21st century, but something that was absolutely part and parcel of the Roman world and all of those cities through which this massive process of distribution and consumption was able to take place, filtering into London and then going out into the broader countryside. And of course, that process of production, consumption, and distribution produces a lot of discard. And this is really, the archaeology is really the story of trash, because what we can see is the materials through which people cycled, the things that became necessary, fell out of fashion after a while, and then became the materials of discard. So when we tell the story of ancient cities, what we're often looking for are those little bits and pieces that help us to understand what actual individuals and households were doing in ancient times, how it was that they were spending their disposable income, what kinds of things they were trying to show off to themselves and to others through their processes of making a home and a household. There are other things that make up a city as well. One of them is the process of migration. So ever since the beginning, cities have been what we can think of as demographic sinks. In other words, the only way that they can even maintain their populations is through migration. And the only way that they can grow is definitely through migration. So ever since the beginning, this process of people moving into cities for various kinds of attractions, for education, for jobs, for employment, for ritual, is something that has made cities come into existence and still exists today. So migration is not a 21st century phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon that has been with us for a long time and that has greatly contributed to the fact that cities exist at all. And finally, there is architecture. So just like our human ancestors had language long before cities, and had objects long before cities, and migration long before cities, they also had architecture before cities. But it's in cities that that sense of architecture really became accentuated, resulting in, as you can see here, but also in ancient times as well, this constant sense of churn, of construction, of reconstruction, of rebuilding, to make cities not a single static place, but a center of constant innovation and change. So we can see that in the archaeological record when we go through all of those deep layers of time, and we can certainly see it in modern cities as our skylines change over time. Now, most of the time when you visit an archaeological site, what you're presented as this grand architecture of the past is something that looks rather like this, which is admittedly a little hard to read. Right? So those of you who have been to Pompeii, where this image is taken from, or to the Roman Forum, you might feel as though it's rather difficult to puzzle through all of those pieces of broken buildings that you're seeing. You feel bad. You feel as though you should have listened to the guide better. Or you should not have had a second glass of wine at lunch. But don't feel bad. Archaeologists are also confused. And that's because ancient people did not leave their cities in pristine condition for us to find. They were constantly rebuilding. Now, we do have friends in the IT department who can start to make urban centers a little bit more readable and to give us a sense of what it was that ancient people were actually experiencing in the past in that dynamic realm of churn that characterized their cities just as much as our cities. And that sense of architecture, that sense of moving in place, if you will, is something that is captured, I think, very nicely in this book called Architecture Depends by the architect and architectural historian Jeremy Till, who's based here in London. And he talks about the way in which architecture is dependent. That in other words, if you put in a building and you want to put something else there, you are still constrained by the surrounding spaces. And I think that London is a fantastic example of that constant process of upgrading and change that nonetheless is dependent on the walls and the existence of streets and infrastructure that came before. So we can take this idea and move it back into the past as well to get a sense of how it is that ancient cities were constantly under modification and upgrade to suit the needs of those many, many moments of time that eventually, for us as archaeologists, became layered. But that we also see in ancient cities the bridges, the tunnels, the connections, the streets, the sewers, the water lines that all made it possible for people to live in these densely occupied spaces that are also with us from the very beginning of urban times. So when we dig, we find not only buildings, but we find the footings and traces of bridges, and we find the traces of sewer pipes and sanitation infrastructure. So that all of those things have always been together in the urban environment. And there's also water. So here you have, of course, the Thames. Many ancient cities are right on the water, either at the confluence of rivers or the shoreline, so that our current preoccupations with water are not new to us as an urban species. Way back in the very beginning of urbanism, the specter of flood is always there, and we can actually see that in the archaeological record, and the concern for fresh water is also always there, and we can also see it in the archaeological record. So whether you were thinking about ancient Chinese cities, for which there is an excellent historical record of the frequency of flooding and the different ways that people have prepared for it, or in modern cities where questions of climate change and sea level rise are increasingly a preoccupation of urban planners, those too are things that have always been with us as an urban species. And that sense of containment and infrastructure is also something that we can see in the spaces of our own urban centers today. So here we are in London, and Denton's is just a little outside of the Roman wall, but that sense of an ancient structure, nearly 2,000 years old, still provides a sense of a contemporary urban container. So we often inherit from our predecessors the infrastructure and the surroundings that become the architecture of our spaces into which we have this dependency and accommodation for the new things that we want to put in. And if we look at the older period of time, just before the modern era, in the medieval world, we can also see that that structuring principle of the Roman wall provided the grounds for this incredible intensity of interactions. And one of the most interesting interactions that we can see that I think we often overlook is the religious component. Within the walls of the Roman portion of the city, that's where you have not only, of course, the magnificent Cathedral of St. Paul's, but you have all of these other churches. And I think that we are so accustomed to thinking of cities as secular that we overlook the tremendous number of religious institutions, not only that we have inherited from the medieval period, but that are still quite robust today. So, what is it that draws people into cities? How is it that cities have sustained themselves? Why is it that they are still growing despite all of the challenges that we might face on a daily basis? This is where the material from the Centers for Cities really comes into play, because the sense of modern urbanism is a way of also thinking about not only the present, but the long-term urbanism. What is it that's brought people in to these urban centers to enable them to grow and thrive? There are many reasons that people come into urban centers, but what we must remember is that people come in as individuals. So often when we're thinking about urbanism, we're thinking about statistics and things that happen a million at a time. But when people come into cities, they're coming in one at a time, or one household at a time. And they come for the potential for community, for religious activity, they come for commerce, they come for shopping, they come for education, they come for jobs. And when we think about the kinds of jobs that draw people into urban spaces, we often think of white-collar jobs. We often think of professional, credentialed, salaried employment. But both in modern cities and in ancient ones, the vast majority of jobs are like this. So people who are coming into urban centers, particularly in the developing world today, not only in India, where I do my own research, but in other parts of the world, people who are leaving the countryside often have no skills whatsoever, and what they're doing is trading their labor for an opportunity to live in the city with the hope of an opportunity of something better, if not for them, than for their children. So there's this giant sense of hope and optimism of people moving into cities to take up these very labor-intensive jobs of being porters or cleaners or food sellers as an entree into the urban economy. And we can actually see this for ancient cities as well, that when we excavate in areas that are low-income areas, we can see that people are crowding into cities in great numbers, even if the conditions are objectively kind of awful. So this sense of what it is that draws people in is not only about these high-end jobs, but about all these other kinds of jobs as well. And how do we know? Well, we've got some ancient evidence. So here's a nice tomb painting from Egypt that shows the kind of diversity of employment and production. You have people engaged in all parts of the manufacturing process and so on. And there you have, standing up, looking worried, is the manager. The manager does not seem to be doing any physical work, but he's taking on the management organization of the team. And yes, managers have been worried for thousands of years. And this is an illustration of what you might think of as sort of typical Roman cobbler shop, where I think here the illustration is also very instructive. Because oftentimes when we think about ancient people working or even modern people working, we're thinking about able-bodied people, we're thinking about the most robust individuals, but we have to remember that in a production facility, especially in the past, you're going to have children, you're going to have people who are in support roles of cleaning and taking care of sourcing materials and transporting and packing and all those kinds of relatively low-skilled jobs that are part of the network of what it is that people do for a living. in an urban center. And here I'd like to call on this nice work by Elena Negrini that reminds us about how this works in the modern world, that you have this corporate world, and then you also have the world of manual labor, packing and transporting and so on. And I think this becomes an excellent rubric for understanding the past as well. It helps us to look better as archaeologists and the kinds of things that we get out of the ground. So the connection between the past and the present is something that is very much a component of archaeological research and looking at this long trajectory of urban life over the last 6,000 years. Because as we know, urbanism has a whole variety of delightful things about it. Right? These are the things that draw us in. These are the things that drew in the ancient Romans, and ancient Chinese people, and ancient Mexicans to ancient Mexico City. All of these wonderful aspects of urbanism that provide to us a scale of entertainment you might not get in the countryside, a scale of education, a scale of monumentality, wonderful opportunities for entertainment that are part of urban life. Oh yes, you get this too. You get crowding, pollution, noise, but somehow we're willing to overlook those things for the opportunities that are at the core of the urban experience. And we know that ancient people also overlooked those objectively bad qualities of urban life, such that of all the cities that were inhabited in ancient times, most of them are still inhabited today. There are more than 4,000 cities of over 100,000 people in the world. And that number is growing. The percent of people who live in cities worldwide has increased just in the last few years from 50 to 55%. And it does not show any signs of slowing down. So no matter how difficult cities become, you cannot keep people out of them. They are on an upward trajectory. So what can we say about this long trajectory of urbanism that has brought us to the present day? What is it that cities of the past and the present have in common? You might think that somehow we're very different because we have electricity and ancient people didn't, or we have mass transit and ancient people didn't. But the things that really matter in urbanism are the same. We have that sense of monumental architecture that drew people into cities and that still draws us in. We have very intricate divisions of labor. If you recall the images of the Roman workshop or the working manager, we didn't need Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations to tell us that if you distribute production among specialized workers, you get more overall production. Ancient managers knew that a long time ago. So this sense of divisions of labor provided opportunities for people with skills, but also people without skills to survive in an urban economy. Those economies were also diverse. So there is the development of new forms of production, but also diverse economies of trade, like the things that brought those Roman tablewares all over the areas of Western Europe and the UK. The idea of having access to a whole variety of new kinds of goods, and for people who were producers, the opportunity to have many new customers. We also get a sense of urban planning that comes in from the very beginning, even though that planning is often concentrated in the ancient equivalent of downtown. Mostly archaeologists have looked in those downtown areas because that's where the big temples and palaces are. As we have started to look in outlying areas, what we're discovering is that we have semi-disorganized suburbs in many ancient cities in the world, very much like the growth of suburbs that we see in the contemporary world as well. We also see infrastructure, that connective tissue of bridges and wells and pipelines that make it possible for new people to move in and to be able to develop their workshops and residences on a kind of what my colleague Andrew Creekmore has called the armature of the city. In other words, that structure into which new people and things can fit. We also see that there is a vast and extensive hinterland for goods and commodities and raw materials that ancient cities have always pulled in from sometimes very long distances, and that, of course, is a marker of the globalized economy today. We also have social networks. Contrary to our expectations that urban worlds are somehow anonymous and depressing and isolating, what we have in urban centers is opportunities for people to be part of many different communities simultaneously. A work community, a religious or ritual community, a sports community, a leisure community, so that people actually have many more ways of interacting with other people in urban places than they would out in the rural countryside. And finally, the thing that really drives modern cities and modern cities' sense of self is the concept of innovation. That you have places where it pays to try to do something different, because even if it's something very unusual, think about where fashion is. Fashion Week is always in cities. Think about where art institutions are. They are always in cities. Think about where many new think tanks are for new kinds of products that we want for solar energy or space exploration or whatever it is. That innovation is happening in cities where you can get the talent and you can get the people and the financing in order to be able to make that happen. So that's cities of the past and the present. I would say we can also call it the future of cities as well, as a package of everything from people to innovation that makes the growth of urbanism not only a reality, but a certainty. Thank you.
Much indeed, Monica. Fascinating sort of scope and panorama of where we've been, where we are. Open it up for questions. But before we do that, can I just, this is the question I had in my mind when the book first arrived, which is, where was the first city? So before anybody, I'm sure others will have that, but just give us some sense as to, what does the archaeological evidence tell us about where that first place might be?
Sure. Well, you'll probably remember from school that Mesopotamia has been called the cradle of civilization. And it's true that Mesopotamia does seem to have the very earliest cities. So there are a couple of good candidates for the first city, if you will. Tel Brak, which is in northern Syria, and then also Uruk, which is in now southern Iraq. Those are places where there's been enough archaeological research drilling all the way down to the bottom to be able to find the very first evidence of settlement. And not long after that, independently, you had cities beginning in Egypt, and then in China, and then in the Indus region of what is now Pakistan and Western India. And then a little bit after that, you also got cities in places like Mexico and Central America and South America, completely without any connection with those other places. So urbanism is definitely not contagious. In fact, urbanism is so challenging that you could almost imagine that in the first city, you can imagine it's crowded, there's a chance of fire, and there's, you can't get your own lunch, you have to have it brought in from the countryside. The first city should have been an experiment that was never repeated.
And yet it was.
And yet it was, over and over.
And you've got an interesting idea in the book around the area that you refer to, that Mesopotamia area, often referred to as the third temple present. You have a different take on that part of the world and why cities emerge on that. Could you just say a little bit more about that?
Right. So anybody who has been to or done research in the area of Mesopotamia, I worked in southern Turkey for a couple of field seasons, and it's a very challenging place. It's very, very hot. It's subject to drought. It's just a difficult place to work. And yet, again, from school, we were all told that Mesopotamia was the Fertile Crescent. That explained why urbanism happened there. But it did not match our experiences. And finally, it was my colleague Tony Wilkinson who came up with the idea that we should not call this the Fertile Crescent. We should call it the Fragile Crescent, because it is rather difficult to make a living there. And that was really brilliant for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it acknowledged the difficulties of the place, but it also brought into our thinking a very provocative idea. Maybe urbanism doesn't happen where everything is so easy. Maybe urbanism happens where there are challenges to be met, that you have that sense of kind of an entrepreneurial, driving entrepreneurial spirit to overcome problems, is something that maybe was part of the impetus of the first cities. When you think about modern cities, they're often in rather challenging places. They are risky. They are subject to floods, or they are subject to earthquakes coming from the west coast of California. We have, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle are all under the sword of Damocles of the earthquake. And yet, despite those disadvantages, they have some enticements that make it worthwhile for people to take the risk of being there.
So the virtue, we should look at it as a virtue, the commute that we have every day when we're struggling. We should remember that's a good thing. Since when we achieve it, when we complete it,
exactly.
We're following in our forebearers in terms of what we've done. Okay, I've got loads of other questions, but let's open it up. We've got a couple of roving mics. If you can raise your hand so I can see you, or see your hand at least, and then I'll point it. We can get a couple going. We'll take a couple. Yeah. Just say who you are.
Hi, Simon, founder of Texas News in DCM Ventures. Very much interested in cities. Now, with the increasing sort of urbanization, and with estimates that 2/3 of the world population is going to be living in cities in the next 35 years, what are the most valuable lessons that city plans can learn from previous history?
That's a wonderful and very important question, because one of the things that I wanted to do with this book is not merely to look at the past of cities or how fun it is to be an archaeologist, because that's true, but to think about what it is we can envision for the future on the basis of this past knowledge. And one of the things that's very clear is that an attention to good governance, in other words, keeping track of things, maintenance, providing for all of the residents of the city, not just those high-end professional earners, is something that marks the success of an ancient city. And so thoughtful infrastructure, densification of housing, which is something the Romans did as soon as they got concrete. Yes, they were building harbors, but they were also building multi-story tenement buildings. So you were able to concentrate people in small spaces. We have nice historical records from China and Japan about what happens when the city floods. And there are officials who are trained to monitor the weather, who are trained to help put the city back together after adverse events. All of that can really only be done on the scale of a civic corporate entity. People cannot make their own street, they cannot dig their own sewer, they cannot make their own train line. Those are things that all have to be centrally placed and planned. So I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I've seen from both the archaeological and historical records, is that good governance and long-term planning really do make a difference.
Very good. Other questions? Just raise your hands. I can see. Yeah, one right at the back. Yeah, just say who you are.
Hi, my name is Ben Hawes, and I work with the Connected Places Catalogue and Ordnance Survey. I'm interested in the relationship between cities and the development of hierarchies. I think there's this idea that social classes, priesthoods, aristocrats, managers, all kind of those divisions come out of cities. But again, people come to cities to escape the hierarchies that they've born into as well. I mean, I just wonder, how you see that sort of dynamic rolling on.
So you're right that people often try to escape a particular hierarchy in the countryside. So this is the situation of landless people all over the world. And if they don't have land and they can't get education, they come into the city to try to have some kind of job. But it's also true that there has been a range of social classes in every ancient city, just as there is in every modern city. So it used to be that archaeologists were really focused on the central portions of ancient cities, the big tomb, the big temple, and it made it look as though cities happened because some ruler came and said, let there be a city here. That's not quite true. What we're finding is that rulers often come into the city after they have been established. This is what some of my colleagues who work in Mesoamerica and the region have found. They've found that the building of the big temples and these big ceremonial grounds actually precedes the existence of palaces. And so rulers are coming where the people are, and there becomes this, this complex interaction of rulership and followership that is really accentuated in an urban realm. But at the same time, you cannot get rid of social classes. There is always going to be a group of people in cities. There are always going to be slums. Every big city in the world has passed through a slum phase. One of the places I talk about in the book is Shanghai, because when you go to Shanghai now, you think of it as this incredible, amazing global city. But if you look at the historical records from 100 years ago, it was really very difficult. People were coming in boats, and they were living in the boat till the boat fell apart, and then they tried to make a shack, and so on. And that now we can also see archaeologically as part of pretty much every ancient city as well. So our goal as urban citizens is to try to improve things for everybody, recognizing that there will always be some group of people in cities who are not as wealthy.
And just go back to Simon's point. When you look at different countries or different points in history, do you see different types of urbanism? Chinese urbanism looks different from Indian urbanism, looks different from Mesoamerican urbanism. Or you set out the kind of common characteristics, the form and function, or function particularly. But do the form massively differ, or do we also you see a long consistency on that as well?
It's a long consistency. It really is amazing the extent to which ancient cities and modern cities have so many of the same kinds of parts. You have this monumental architecture, you have these big broad streets of elite residences, you have the crowded quarters of slums, you've got marketplaces, you've got festival grounds, you've got open places and plazas, and each one of those types of architecture fulfills a particular kind of need, amongst which I think some of the most dynamic are these empty spaces. You think about open places, or think about Trafalgar Square or someplace like that, or think about the streets, right? Like, streets are meant to be avenues for traffic, but last weekend the streets in London turned into something else. So there's this sense of these big open spaces become a kind of a social opportunity for expression that we see in every ancient city. So all of those component parts, astonishingly enough, are really the same.
And what about issues around consistency of location? Since you are going to places that are still inhabited today, and they were 6,000 years ago. But just say something a little bit more about that, whether there is a consistency or noticeable areas where we had big civilizations before, but now big cities before, and no longer. What does that? I guess that's partly about. What does that tell us a little bit about the future?
Right. So we know that some ancient cities have disappeared or collapsed altogether, and this is of concern to us because we want to see if our cities have a similar fate in the future. I think that's very unlikely because now we have the power of the nation state. And it is in the interest of the nation state not to allow cities to fail. We have a good example in the United States is the city of New Orleans, which is right there at the bottom of the Mississippi, and probably should have been abandoned a long time ago, even before Hurricane Katrina in 2005. You can also see another example with this hurricane that we have now, that's happening right now. If there is a city that is very badly damaged, that in the past, people might have left and relocated to someplace else. But there is no way that the United States will allow Miami to be wiped off the map altogether. So because of the power of the nation state, it seems very unlikely that modern cities will become abandoned or depopulated. The only example I can think of is Chernobyl, a city that's been abandoned in the last 1,000 years. And that's something beyond the capacity of the nation state to clean up. But that could change.
Good. Yes, right. We have two right down the front, so if we can bring both mics to one right in the front, and then one just behind. And then Nick behind. Just say who you are.
Hello, Dominique from Media. Based on your understanding of the future of cities, which cities are going to survive the sustainability crisis that we're having, the global crisis, the economic crisis, which is going to come out on top? Where are we all going to be living in 600 years' time if we're all around?
I think they're all going to survive in some shape or another. And you know, you can see that there is a kind of momentum even when the nation state is not in good condition. So think about a city like Kinshasa, which is in a nation that is not very functional, but the city itself is still going on, in part because of the networks that it sustains with other urban areas. And so I think that all cities will go on, they'll lurch along. Some of them will excel and thrive, and some of them will simply lurch along. But they're all going to be there, and you know, new ones will also spring up. The question about sustainability is also a fascinating one. One of my other jobs at UCLA is that I'm in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And this sustainability rubric is very popular and it's very important, but we don't really know what it means. Because is sustainability going back to the 19th century and having stasis? Is sustainability allowing for 2% growth or 4% growth or 6% growth? Depending on who you ask, all of those scenarios could be sustainable. So it's a very popular concept, the implications of which we are still working out.
Yeah, Nick.
Nicholas Falk, Urban Trust. I'm very interested in how far cities can change direction and change their position within a network or hierarchy. Thinking of India, one sees how the megacities like Chennai are growing so much faster than the mid-sized cities, attracting so much more investment. The same sort of situation seems to happen in the UK. And I also was struck by going to Hampi, which had more or less disappeared, and yet apparently was one of the greatest cities in southern India. So are these just facts of life related to, I don't know, the availability of amounts of water, or are there things you feel that are very much a product of the human beings within those cities, how well they work together, how successful they are in attracting investment and so on?
That's a wonderful question because it's a very hopeful one. What can we do to make cities better, recognizing the constraints of environments that they're in and so on? So one of the things that they're doing in India is to accelerate the smart cities concept. And the city that's closest to where my colleague and I have been working is the city of Bhubaneswar, which is right next to the ancient city of Trafalgar. So what we can say is Bhubaneswar has actually been a smart city for the last 2,000 years or so. And they have brought this idea of the past as an anchor to the present in a way that emphasizes education, in a way that emphasizes connectivity. So probably 100 years ago, that link was most on things like natural resources. Which city was lucky enough to be close to natural resources? But now it's better to be smart than lucky in a way, because even cities that are really suffering from natural resource deficits like Chennai, a terrible water deficit, that is not keeping people out. So they're really focusing on innovation to overcome natural constraints.
And just say something that you talked about and actually used the images of the Roman pottery, both in terms of its origins in Italy, but then its replication in France, and then how that was. Just say something about how trade and trade-in networks evolved over time, as the evidences we've got, and how then that affects how cities interact with each other.
Yes, I mean, many people who are scholars of urbanism are thinking about modern global cities as almost superseding the nation states in which they find themselves, because they are so connected. On the Pacific Rim, to give you an example from Los Angeles, we are as connected with Hong Kong and Tokyo, Shanghai and Melbourne as we are with cities that are 60 kilometers inland, because the world is now connected through these trade opportunities and also through migration. We have a tremendous amount of migration of professionals. So we have professionals from India and from China and from South America who who are coming to take jobs in the US and then taking their entrepreneurial experience back with them so that when they go back to Caracas or Johannesburg, they then make their networks with the urban folks that they have met in those other places. And so the nation state is still critical, but it's almost as though there are two planes of interaction. There's the urban plane of interaction and there's the national plane of interaction. And somehow they do connect, but the urban network has almost taken on a global life of its own. So for 300 or 400 years, even though we think of the Roman Empire as being centered in Rome, there were so many cities all around the entirety of the Roman Mediterranean, and they were connected by water transport, which was the cheapest form of transport. It is still the cheapest form of transport. And so the Romans were absolutely taking advantage of that knowledge to move things very improbably like grain. We think of, grain must be a bulky good that must come from nearby a city because otherwise how is it worth transport? But we know that grain ships were going back and forth from Rome to North Africa, to Sicily, to Egypt, and that sense of being able to bring together an entire hinterland of provisioning through water transport is something that's very common. Up and down the Ganges, it was like that. All over China, it was like that. The Yangtze, the Yellow River. So it was really a trade integrated urban economy.
Great. Let's take another bunch of questions. Yeah, one there, one there. Just keep your hands up. So, is it just on this side? Yeah. Just say who you are again. Yeah.
Nam, I work for an economic consulting company right around the corner. So I was just wondering if, what with all this fervor and excitement for cities and urban agglomeration, do you think that there's a risk of developing almost like a monoculture of cities where policy planners think of everything as cities and everyone as living in cities, and whether this will lead to people who live outside of cities feeling like they've been left behind, and for every settlement to sort of just look the same, feel the same?
Yeah, so cities versus the rest, we hear this quite a lot on many different fronts. Your thoughts on that? And again, whether there's any evidence that these sorts of issues and differences were playing out, through time.
The beginning of urbanism was also the beginning of ruralism, right? Because before there were cities, everyone was exactly the same. It was just a world of very small villages. But as soon as you started to have people in these larger centers with all the monumental architecture and infrastructure and crowded neighborhoods and so on, you did have a world that was divided into two parts. And we know this from the historical records. We know that the ancient Romans were writing at the same time they were charmed by the countryside, the idea of the rural as an escape. But then they would go out to the countryside and they would get rather bored and they would come back into the city. So there's always been this awareness of the rural as the necessary counterbalance to urbanism. And yet people in rural places are just as agentive as people in cities, right? They are selectively engaging with city life. So think about all the people out in rural places who will come to the city for education, or they'll come to the city to see a show. They are using the urban center in their own way. So they elect not to live here, but they partake selectively. And so I don't think that rural folks are necessarily feeling left out. They are just as deliberately structuring their relationship to the city as city people are structuring their relationship to the countryside. Plus, we need that countryside because no one is growing wheat in London to make bread. Right? No one is keeping animals here for milk. Right? Without the countryside, a city cannot exist.
And that's always been the case.
Always.
Ellie, all right.
Ellie Thomas, I'm from the Design Council, and what I think probably most people in this room are here to do is to sort of design a city that works better, whether that's an economy or if it's the built environment or if it's a social network. But what you describe is a kind of inevitability about those trends that have existed for a long time and will continue to exist. So what do you think the scope for change is What are the things that people have tried to change in the past that have worked? And what should we treat as inevitable, or what should we actually seek to improve?
I think one of the most important things we can see in the changing urban environment of ancient places is the sense of densification. And it's something that we are struggling with in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is very low rise and very spread out. And we're now seeing a number of good studies of what happens when you densify areas, particularly around transport networks, so that you've got buildings that have storefronts on the bottom, and you've got 3 or 4 stories of residential space on top. And that provides a great environment for people to then access goods and services more efficiently, being in a more densely occupied place, which is then also a good way to build up a social network so that people are not isolated in a small flat space, but they're in an area where they can get better access to goods and services. We can measure this, for example, in elderly people who move back into cities because access to medical care is more immediate, because access to goods and services is more immediate, more entertainment and other kinds of things that people want. So we know that there was often in the past a kind of administrative presence of temples and palaces in ways that are a little bit more attenuated today. For example, many cities in the past did not have coined money, which is a very interesting idea. You have perfectly functional cities in many parts of the world before the invention of coinage. So coinage comes along about the first millennium BC, and cities are 3,000 years earlier than that. So there's definitely a lot of interaction where people are getting paid not in money that they then have to transfer into food, but they're getting paid in rations directly. And we find ration bowls literally by the millions in these ancient cities. So people are getting their allocation of food through grain that's being delivered directly. So the temple or the palace is getting grain from the countryside, and they're wonderful cuneiform tablets. You owe me 25 sheep, or please send 130 liters of grain. We have some great documents. If you ever have a chance to read some ancient letters from Mesopotamia, they're wonderful. They'll look exactly like the email you sent this morning.
Yes.
Hi, Jacob Penrose, as a civil servant. Silly question, I think, but is there a distinction between towns and cities?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Oftentimes when we're counterbalancing the urban and the rural, we forget that there is an intermediary that is the town. And archaeologists have not at all caught up to thinking about towns as either a permanent, long-term habitation of modest size, or as the precursor to these growing cities. We know in modern times there are towns that grow into urban centers. That, I think, is where one of the best next types of research for archaeology can take place, is what is it that makes a town? Because a town is already big enough that you don't know everybody. There are strangers in a town. But it doesn't grow to the same extent. You don't have to have as much infrastructure. That's an excellent question, because it is a stable, intermediate size population that's clearly very important in the modern world, and I think also had an excellent role in the ancient world, and we just quite haven't focused on that yet, but they are really important. Thank you.
So just on that, because you started by talking us through a little bit about the archaeological process and kind of digging as the last resort in many respects. But I mean, what's the innovation frontier in terms of archaeology? Because you said you're using satellite imagery, much more data to understand what's going on, to focus on where actually to dig. But just give us a sense as to what the next lot of technological evolution is going to be in archaeology.
Right, so one of the most amazing things that have been developed in the last decade or so is something called LiDAR, which is an airborne radar system on a drone or on a plane. And what that can do is reflect the surface that is under vegetation. So a lot of cities in the world, particularly in the Maya region of southern Mexico and Central America, have so much jungle that the only thing we could see is the big pyramid And that led to some rather wrong ideas about why the city was there, or who was living in it, or that it was just a ceremonial center. Now I have colleagues who have done the LiDAR surveys, and they realize that these ancient cities have suburbs and road networks and pathways that stretch out exactly like modern suburbs. It has really revolutionized the way that we understand ancient cities, not as something very different from our own, but that in archaeology we're playing catch up by trying to find the evidence of the ways that they're similar.
And what's the area of the world where we know least about their cities historically? What do we really don't know very much about this part of the world and how cities evolved and developed there?
Right, so the places for which we have the least comprehensive evidence is in Africa, because there's been work obviously in Egypt, there's been some work in the Inland Niger Delta, there's been some work on the Swahili coast, but the amount of research has really been quite minimal compared to the Roman world or increasingly China or Indus Valley cultures. So that's because I've recently been writing a paper on ancient urban floods and the evidence for ancient flooding, and it is the place where I've had the most difficulty finding sustained archaeological research. But we know that there is a whole range of towns and cities that date back a couple of thousand years, and I think that that's where some of the most promising research can be done, because those are often very difficult conditions for ancient people, and yet they clearly thrive. I would love to know more about that part of the world.
Subject for the next book, or a next book. I think that concludes the formal proceedings. So I'd like to thank Denton's again for hosting us, obviously you for coming, and particularly for Monica in giving us a fascinating talk and insight into the work that she's been doing in very different parts of the world, but actually how it all connects when we think about our cities. I do urge you to buy or at least read the book. If you don't have to buy, you can hire it or get it from a local library. It's in my local library where I live, which is very good. It's fascinating in terms of the insights it provides, and it tells us a lot, I think, about where our cities are and where they're going, as much as what it tells us about cities over the last 6,000 years. So join with me to thank Monica for her presentation. The next event in the City Horizons series will be in November, date to be confirmed, venue here, at least that's what I hope. Looking at Stephen, my colleague from Devon in front. And our speaker on that evening will be Stian Westlick. Stian is the co-author of a book with Jonathan Haskell called Capitalism Without Capital, and the kind of rise of the intangible economy, and what that means for our economy, and particularly the increasingly important